So, as you know, Labor have defended their broken promise on superannuation taxation, the doubling of the tax on accounts worth more than $3 million. They've defended that by declaring that only 1 in every 200 people will be affected. That is, 0.5% of people with super will be hit by the new tax hike. Well, that goes up every year, of course. It'll be double that by the end of the decade. And today in the Senate, Matt Canavan managed to extract a timeline for when 1 in 10 Australians will pay the extra tax.
In 30 years, Treasury projects that roughly only the top 10% of earners will retire with superannuation balances of around $3 million or more.
So 1 in 10, that's quite a few people, right? That's 20 times more people than Labor's talking about right now. And 30 years is some way off, fair enough, but of course that means that tens of thousands of people who are now paying super will be hit. People in their 20s and their 30s now, at least 10% of them will now pay the doubled tax on their superannuation eventually. I spoke to Finance Minister Jane Hume, the Shadow Finance Minister Jane Hume, earlier about how this is quite a different reality to the tiny little cohort that Labor's been talking about.
That's exactly right. For last week we heard that it was only going to be 36,000 people that were going to be affected. Then the week before, after that, it became 80,000 people, only 0.5% of the population. Now we're hearing that it's going to be 1% of the population by 2030 and 10% of the population by 2050. So you can see why this policy is so tricky, why Labor have not just gone back on a promise, but they've developed a policy that, by its intentional design features, will cost Australians more and more as the years wear on. This is not just about the top end of town, the people with $3 million in superannuation today. This is going to affect generations to come. Talk about intergenerational equity. I don't think Labor's money is where its mouth is, or they're not walking the talk, I probably should say. They've got plenty of money where their mouth is.
Yeah, look, Labor would have known these figures all along. They've had to be squeezed out of them through Senate questioning today and then in the House of Reps. And Labor are now really downplaying the revelations. Here's what the Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, said in Parliament.
Right now, in 2025, less than 0.5% of people will be impacted.
Order.
By the time we... Let me
Order.
finish. Let me wait for it. Wait for it. Let me finish. By the beginning of next decade, it will be around 1%. And the answer that Senator Gallagher, Minister Gallagher, the great finance minister in the other place, gave a moment ago is in 30 years, 1 in 10 people will be impacted by it.
Now, this is interesting, Jane, because when you're talking about super, of course you're talking about the future. What happens in 10, 20, 30 years is important. So what this admission means today is that if you're under 35, if you're in the workforce and you're under 35, then there's 10% chance. 10% of those people will end up being caught by this super tax doubling.
And the number 10% doesn't seem to mean an awful lot to people. However, today, the top 10% of income earners earn above $131,000. That doesn't sound like an awful lot. So you can understand why people would be rightly nervous. Not only has this policy been framed in such a way that unrealised capital gains are all of a sudden able to be taxed. That's a giant change to the tax system, one we've never seen before in Australia, indeed in any other jurisdiction really. And the fact that it's not indexed means the net grows wider and wider every year. But most importantly, I think, Chris, is that this policy is designed to rake in money for budget repair, not to improve the superannuation system, not to make the superannuation system more sustainable into the future, not to help more young people save for their retirement. It's for budget repair now. And of course, the best way to repair the budget is to stop spending, to control those spending urges. And that's what we'd like to see the government do, not come after the hard-earned savings of retirees who have relied on a system set up the way it is.
Nonetheless, news poll today shows that almost 2/3 of Australians support this tax increase. How do you deal with that level of popularity for the measure?
Well, I wonder what would have happened if that question that was surveyed was not, do you agree that people in the top 0.5% should be taxed more on their superannuation balances to pay for budget repair? Rather, it was, do you think that governments should be allowed to break their election promises willy-nilly? Or perhaps, do you agree that in 30 years' time that 10% of people should have to pay more tax on their superannuation earnings? I think if those questions had have been asked, you might have got a very different response.
Yeah, we will see. The debate's got a long way to play out, Senator. But when it comes to this policy, Peter Dutton's made it very clear that the Coalition will promise to repeal this tax increase. But does that mean that, is that all you would do, or will you take a package to the next election that proposes some sort of reform, clarification, simplification, whatever you like to describe it, of the superannuation tax situation?
Well, I think that Australia will be very clear on exactly what our superannuation policy proposals will be prior to the next election, but we will go to the election promising to repeal this legislation, this unfair legislation. And more,
Senator, but you'll do more.
Promise.
But you'll have more than that. There'll be some sort of super reform there.
We will take a package. We will take a package to the next election that is about superannuation, that I think that will encourage Australians to save for their retirement, that will encourage people to put money away, but also will give them a much better chance of financial security in retirement, rather than surprising people with a brand new tax on their retirement savings. So they're breaking promises right, left and centre. This is on top of the promise of $275 off your energy bills. This is another broken promise from this government, and only 9 months in.
Senator Jane Hume, thanks so much for joining us.
Great to be with you, Chris.